It was the first week of November, and I had the day off from work. Now I was on my way to One Stop Auto Shop after running errands all morning. I always go this time of year to get my tires changed and rotated on my Jeep Wrangler for the winter. On my way out the door this morning, my wife reminded me that I had written down on the calendar that the Jeep also needed an inspection and oil change as well. I was a regular at the shop, so when I arrived, coming through the door hearing that familiar chime, Jimmy the head mechanic greeted me with a smile and a wave. "Hey Danny, good afternoon." I told him the work that I needed done, and he said the wait would be a few hours because they were busy today and there were a few cars ahead of me. I didn't mind waiting. I had already run all of my other errands before coming here anyway. Plus, I had to catch up on my football stats for my fantasy football league. I planned on making the guys jealous of my dream team this year. I settled down in a seat next to an older gentleman who looked to be about in his mid to late 70s. Just as I was pulling out my phone, he said,
"Hello, how are you doing?"
I put my phone back in my pocket and smiling at him I responded, "Fine, thanks. How are you?" He told me that his name was Lester and explained that he had gotten there an hour ago and been waiting ever since.
My intake manifold has been cracked for the last month. Now coolant is leaking out of a pipe above my alternator. I shouldn't have let it go for so long, but I've been busy.
I smiled at him, not understanding a word that he just said to me. I'd heard of an alternator before, but couldn't tell you what it looked like, where it was located, or what it was for. I'm not really a hands-on do-it-yourself type of guy. That's why I come here. He told me,
I don't have a ride to pick me up or bring me back when my baby's ready to get picked up.
as he pointed to a burgundy Crown Victoria that the mechanics were pulling into the workshop.
I used to fix my car myself. I used to be a mechanic. But I'm getting too old now. I have arthritis in my hands, and now they can't do what they used to.
With a laugh, I told him, "What? Old man, you don't look a day over 20. He let out a loud, deep, hearty laugh.
You're a funny one, huh?
You said you used to be a mechanic, I asked him. He replied,
I was born and raised in Westmore, Vermont. I moved here to Burlington after I met my wife Charlotte 35 years ago.
He glanced at the wedding ring on his left hand and smiled. Many, many years ago, when I was a handsome young man, I owned my own shop. I called it Lester's Gas and Auto Repair. My daddy was a mechanic his whole life, and my granddaddy was a mechanic before him, so it was always a dream of mine to open up my very own shop. My daddy always wanted to do it, but never did accomplish it. He was a gambling man and could never hold on to enough money to buy himself a shop. So when I finally did it, he was so proud. I was the only mechanic around for 50 miles, so we got lots of business. I had 3 other guys who worked for me, Barney, Cliff, and Walter. Cliff was the gas attendant, so he would stand out there all day next to the pump, rain or shine. That boy was as pale as a ghost when he first came to work for me, but in the summer he'd be as dark as the morning brew from the sun beaming down on him all day. But he never once complained. Barney and Walter were both mechanics that I hired to come work for me. Walter was a young boy who had gotten into some trouble. You know kids, hanging out with the wrong crowd. He went to jail for robbery and had just been released, so I asked him to come work for me. I needed the help, and I knew he was a good kid. He never gave me no trouble. Barney was my best friend. We grew up together, and he was always interested in cars. He liked learning about their parts and how they worked. He didn't know everything about cars when he came to work for me, but he knew enough. Let's just say he learned a lot on the job. He stopped the conversation to glance at his watch. Then he yelled at Jimmy, who was standing outside smoking a cigarette.
Hey, excuse me, young man. I have to get out of here before dark. I don't see too well to drive at night.
Jimmy assured him that his car would be ready shortly. I started pulling out my phone again so I could start checking out these stats, glad that the old man's rambling was done. But then I heard him clear his throat and say, "Where was I?" Continuing on with his story. "Yes, so I was working late one night. We were real busy, had 2 customers waiting, and a lady pulls up right before 5 o'clock. We never turned a customer away, so I told her if she didn't mind waiting, then we would fix her car up for her. She owned a 1957 black Chevy Corvette. She was a real flashy lady, good looking too. You could tell she had money. She looked to be in her 30s and was wearing a black and white polka dot dress that hugged her waist tightly with a pair of black and white high heel shoes. Her black coat was unbuttoned, and she had a black and white polka dot handbag dangling from her wrist that matched her dress perfectly. Even though it was a cool, dreary autumn day, she wore a pair of black cat-eye sunglasses with dark lenses and silver rhinestones in each of the corners. Her long, jet-black hair was pulled up into her sun hat, and her ruby-red lipstick made her beauty that much more stunning. She pulled into the shop riding on a flat and said that she didn't have the tools to fix it. She told me she didn't mind waiting, and her long, pointy, ruby-red nails jabbed me in the palm as she handed me her keys. It's not like she had much of a choice anyway. She couldn't drive 50-something miles to the next repair shop on a rim. So she sat down in our little waiting area, removed her sunglasses, and placed them into her handbag. One of the men waiting for their vehicle was Arthur Ferguson, the town drunk. He'd been sitting there waiting for a few hours now because he needed quite a bit of work done on his station wagon. We were working on his brakes when the woman arrived. Arthur struck up a conversation with the lady, telling her where to find the best bars in town. She stared at him with a kind smile, acting like she was interested in what he had to say. So he kept on talking, and the woman just sat there quietly listening, but not saying much. She'd smile or nod her head every now and again. Arthur was just happy to be talking to a pretty lady. All of the women that hung out down at the local bar weren't much to look at. Anyways, we were just about done with his car when the radio began to play. Barney wheeled himself out from under the car and glanced around to see what was going on. He got up and slowly walked around the car, but found no one around. Then a strange look spread across his face as he reached into the pocket of his overalls and pulled out the keys belonging to the station wagon. I was standing in the office and saw the strange look that Barney had on his face, so I came on out to see what was going on. He called me over and explained that he had been under the car working on the brakes when the radio just cut on by itself. Now it was playing without any keys in the ignition at all. I have to admit, it was odd, but we didn't have time to be investigating the cause when we had work to get done. And that's not what Arthur was paying us to fix anyhow. There were still 3 customers waiting, so I told him to get back to work. Walter, my other mechanic, told Barney that he would finish up the brakes on the station wagon while Barney took a break. Barney was still thinking about the radio, so he agreed and headed outside. Arthur didn't seem to be in any hurry to get his car anymore now that the pretty lady showed up. He was still chatting her up, showing off his gold watch now. It was very nice, but it didn't really belong to him. It was actually his younger brother's. He was in the army, and let's just say when he'd been deployed, Arthur held on to it. So I strolled over to the waiting area and told him that his car would be ready soon. He tells me, "Take your time," with a big grin. That's not what he was saying before the woman came along. He was asking us if we were almost done every 15 minutes. He asked the lady if she would like a smoke, and she politely declined, telling him that she doesn't smoke, so he excused himself and went outside. I asked her, "Is he bothering you, miss?" She said, "He's no bother, but doesn't he know smoking kills you?" Then she snapped her fingers. Poof, one day you're gone, just like that. She asked how much longer she would have to wait, and I told her that it'd be another hour or so. We were just about done with Arthur's station wagon, but there was another customer who'd been waiting ahead of her, Charlie Daniels, and he had a Ford pickup that needed a tire alignment and oil change. I looked over at Charlie, who was slumped down in a chair. "Unless you mind the lady going ahead of you. She just has a flat. It shouldn't take long to fix." Charlie was a miserable old man, and he replied, "Of course I mind. I've been waiting here for hours. She can wait just like the rest of us." The woman just looked at Charlie with a smile. "Sorry, miss, but you'll have to wait a little longer. He was here first," I told her. She replied, "That's fine. I have time to kill anyway," and then stood up and headed outside. I went to check on Walter to see how he was coming along with the brakes, and he was just finishing as I walked up. I peeked my head outside and called to Barney, telling him that I needed the keys to the station wagon because we were finished. He tossed them over, and as I turned around to head back inside, I was nearly plowed down by Walter. I asked him what was going on, and he told me that the station wagon was going crazy. I wasn't sure what he meant by that. How could a car go crazy? I rushed inside to see what all of the fuss was about, and indeed, the station wagon was going crazy. By crazy, I mean headlights flickering, windshield wipers flailing back and forth, and the radio was playing again. It didn't make any sense. How could all of this be happening when I was clearly holding the keys in my right hand at that moment? I walked back outside and called out to Arthur, who still hadn't returned from smoking his cigarette. I didn't see him standing out front, so I headed around to the back of the shop. That's where most of the customers went to smoke because they knew I didn't like them smoking out front near the gas pump. When I rounded the corner of the building, it was deserted except for the dumpster, porta potty, and some empty boxes back there. I knocked on the porta potty door, and when there was no response, opened it and peeked inside. It was empty. So I thought maybe he had made his way back inside while I was on my way around back, and we missed each other. I hurried back inside, and he wasn't in there either. Everyone had made their way back in by now, so I asked them, "Has anyone seen Arthur?" Each and every one of them shook their head or replied no, that they hadn't seen him. It was very peculiar that he was nowhere to be found. His car was still sitting here in the shop, and there was no place around for nearly 50 miles, unless he headed back into town, but that was still at least an hour's walk. I was baffled, but I hopped into his station wagon, drove it out of the workshop, and parked it in the parking lot. Then I safely placed the keys into my jumpsuit and headed back inside. Walter had already pulled Charlie's car into the workshop and was in the process of driving it onto the lift to get started with draining the oil. Barney was standing by so that when Walter was finished, they could get the tire alignment started. He paused from telling me the story, got up, and walked over to the shop's window to check on the progress the mechanics had made on his car. He mumbled to himself,
Oh, good. They're working on it.
He let out a sigh and glanced at his watch again, then removed his spectacles and began cleaning them off with the bottom of his shirt. I thought about pulling my phone out again, but knew the old man was going to keep talking, so I just sat there and waited. Then he started up again. As I was saying, right about the time Barney was driving Charlie's truck onto the lift, the shop's lights began to flicker. That wasn't uncommon when we were expecting bad weather, such as thunderstorms and rain in the area, but there was nothing in the forecast for that night. Barney hopped out of the truck, keys still in the ignition, and yells, "What in the hell is going on around here tonight?" I said to him, "Why don't you fill out the paperwork in my office and I'll help Walter with the alignment?" He gladly obliged and quickly strolled away. So I hopped into the truck and drove it the rest of the way onto the lift, put it into park, and hopped back out. Walter was already waiting with all of the necessary tools, so I raised the lift, and once it was where we needed it to be, Walter and I got to work. I got started on the back tires while he worked on the front. Suddenly the shop lights flickered again. I stopped for a second, but then focused back on what I was doing as soon as I could see my wrench again. But when the lights went completely out and I heard gasps, I headed toward my office to search for a flashlight. "Everybody stay calm, it's all right, no reason to be alarmed," I told them as I proceeded to my office. Thankfully, it wasn't too dark yet. The sun was just setting and it was beginning to get dusk out. When I finally made it to the steps leading upstairs, I gripped the banister tightly. I made my way up and found the doorknob and then entered. I called out Barney's name, but there was no answer. "Barney, where in the hell are you?" I made my way over to my desk and pulled out the bottom drawer, moving my hand around aimlessly, trying to locate a flashlight. Finally, I found one, and as I was making my way back downstairs, I heard a loud crash, and then it was followed by a blood-curdling scream. I heard someone shout from downstairs, "What in the world was that?" I raced down the remaining steps and shined my flashlight around. Charlie and the woman were still in the waiting area, and Arthur still hadn't showed up, and now Barney was missing as well. The woman sat there, still waiting patiently, not alarmed at all by whatever that noise had been. Charlie was now standing, and a worried look covered his face. I burst through the swinging doors into the shop and shined the light over to where Walter was working on Charlie's truck, and my face froze in fear. The hydraulic lift had collapsed, and the truck was now crushing the lower half of Walter's body. A look of horror filled Charlie's face as we both dashed over to help. We were able to lift the front of the truck with a rusty old floor jack and drag him out from under it. I gazed over at the woman to ask for help, and she was now standing at the window. I shouted, "Miss, can we get some help over here?" I shined the light toward her, and she glanced over with the same kind-hearted smile, but before she had the chance to reply, Barney strolled in. I angrily asked him, "Where in the hell have you been?" He told me that he had been in the porta-potty around back. We had a bathroom inside of the shop, but Barney liked to go out back and use the porta-potty when he had to go number 2 because he liked his privacy. Barney darted over when he realized what had occurred. "Holy shit, what happened?" I explained that the power had gone out, and when I went to retrieve a flashlight, I returned to find Walter under the truck. Barney began to panic as he saw the extent of his injuries. There was blood everywhere. I screamed, "Call an ambulance!" as I kneeled down by Walter's side. He was coughing up blood and everything looked broken. There were gashes all over him and a bone protruding from his left leg, and his right arm was bent backwards in the opposite direction. "We can't, the power's out, remember?" someone replied. I couldn't let this young man die right here in front of me, bleeding to death. I had to do something. So I grabbed the flashlight and headed to the back of the shop to check the breaker box. As I was passing by the lady, I shined my flashlight in her direction, and she still looked unbothered, like all of this was normal. She even had a slight smirk on her face. When I reached the box, I flicked all of the switches and the lights flickered, but the power remained off. So I headed back to the front and instructed the guys to get some clean towels and rags so that we could apply pressure to Walter's wounds. Then we carried him to Barney's car and they drove away headed for the town hospital. So now it was just me, Charlie, and the lady customer still there. I glanced back and forth between the both of them. Did either of you see what happened? The woman just shook her head and Charlie said no, it was too dark to see anything through the bay window. The woman nodded her head in agreement. Suddenly there was a loud crash outside. I raced out the door to see what it was and saw Barney's Volvo flipped over in a ditch a little ways down the road. Charlie and I ran over and saw a moose standing in the middle of it. When we approached the car, I immediately knew that Walter was dead. His eyes looked empty, but I checked his pulse anyway, and there wasn't one to be found. Barney was passed out with an enormous gash on his forehead and cuts all over his body from the shattered glass. We pulled him out and carried him back to the shop. Now the lady was standing outside, rubbing her arms and shaking. That made me think maybe this was the last straw. All of this must have finally rattled her. But as I got closer, I saw the same smile on her face, and she said, "Ooh, it's really getting nippy out here. May I hold the door for you?" We carried him in and laid him down across 4 chairs in the waiting area. After we got him settled, Charlie screamed at the woman, "Are you crazy, lady? How can you be so calm talking about, 'May I hold the door for you,' when someone just died?" He stormed off mumbling, "I'm going to wash this blood off of me, freaking crazy broad." When Charlie returned from the restroom, I told the two of them we've got to get out of here. Charlie agreed, but the woman stayed silent. So we go outside to my Studebaker, but when I put the key in the ignition to start it, it wouldn't turn over. The battery was drained, but luckily I had a battery charger in the shop, so I hooked it up and waited a little while before giving it another try, but it still didn't turn over. Suddenly, I got a whiff of smoke. A moment later, the smell became overwhelming and I called for Charlie. When he exited my car, we followed the smoke trail and it led us to the back of the shop. The dumpster was on fire. Well, it had been on fire, but the fire was out by the time we got back there. All we could see was smoke lingering around the lid of the dumpster. When I pushed it open, smoke billowed out, and once it cleared, we find a dead corpse, burnt to a crisp. After I spotted the shiny gold watch on the corpse's left wrist, I realized it was Arthur. This time I stopped the story. I stared at Lester in astonishment. All of this happened in one night? That sounds crazy. Lester replied,
Just wait. It gets crazier.
He excused himself and headed toward the restrooms. When he was out of sight, I thought to myself, at first this old geezer was annoying me with all of his ranting, but now his story really has me intrigued. I guess my football stats will have to wait. Lester returns and looks at his watch before sitting back down.
Well, I've got plenty of time to tell you the rest.
Then he settles back in his seat and continues. After we discovered Arthur's body in the dumpster, I heard someone screaming my name. So I rushed back inside the shop and saw that Barney had woken up. He was rubbing the gash on his forehead when we walked in. I asked him what in the hell happened out there. He tells me that he was in a rush trying to get Walter to the hospital when a moose appeared out of nowhere right in the middle of the road. I tried to dodge it, and that's the last thing I remember. But I swear it wasn't there, and then the next second it was. Something is going on around here. Charlie butted in yelling and pointing at the lady. It's this crazy broad. We all look over at the woman, and she's just sitting in the corner, in the shadows, admiring her nails. Just then, the lights unexpectedly come back on. Then the lady says to all of us, "How could I do anything? I've been sitting here the entire time waiting for my car to be fixed." Then she turns to me with a smile and asks, "Speaking of, when will it be ready?" I notice her smile looks bigger than before. Just as I was answering her, I heard the sound of gravel being crushed under rubber tires. Someone was pulling into the gas station. I peek out the window and see a young girl, early 20s, get out of her two-door sedan and place the pump into her gas tank. Then she came walking toward the shop. When she enters, she looks around at us and asks, while holding the money in her hand, "Who do I pay?" I stepped forward and accepted the money from her. Then Charlie stepped forward, begging the girl for a ride back to town. Next, Barney stood up and begged the girl to take him to the hospital. He told Charlie to take his own damn truck and drive back to town, which was impossible because his truck was still dangling from the lift. She explained that she just came from town. She was moving, so she was headed in the opposite direction. She looked back and forth between Charlie and Barney and said, "But my back seat and trunk are full of my things, so I only have room for one of you." "Can't you just leave a few of your boxes here and pick them up later?" Barney asked. The girl looked at him like he was nuts. "Leave my things here with a bunch of people I don't know?" "Yeah, right." After hearing that, they both rushed to the door, arguing over who was going. I tell them to calm down and that my battery will be charged any minute and the other can just ride back to town with me. "I don't give a damn where you're headed. I'm getting the hell out of here," Charlie barked at the girl. The girl glances around the shop and notices the lady sitting in the corner smoking a cigarette and asks, "Can I get a pull?" The woman smiles a big toothy grin and replies, "Sure, you can finish it off. I'm done." Then she hands it to the girl. I could have sworn she told Arthur that she didn't smoke. Meanwhile, Charlie and Barney's arguing has turned into a fist fight now. I'm shocked when I see old man Charlie punch Barney square in the nose. With blood dripping from his nose now, Barney yells, "I'm going to mess you up, old man." I can tell the girl is getting annoyed with the two of them when she throws the cigarette down and says, "If you two don't cut it out, I'm not taking anyone anywhere." The next thing I know, flames erupt and form a stream back to the pump. The girl had forgotten that she left the gas running and it had overflowed. When she realizes what is happening, she rushes out the door and Barney is right behind her after knocking Charlie to the ground. I yell after them not to go out there, it's too dangerous, but they were both already running to the car trying to stomp out the trail of flames. A big explosion erupted and I dived behind the counter. Then when I saw it was safe, I rushed out there searching the rubble and debris for them. I found both of them yards away from the gas pump. Their bodies were impaled with glass and metal shards all over them. The girl was gargling blood and Barney was wheezing but suddenly stopped when I approached him. When I re-enter the shop, I see that the explosion has caused the power to go back out. Charlie is still laying in the doorway and I help him up. When we make it all the way inside, I hear laughter, uncontrollable laughter. Charlie freaks out and screams, "I knew it! She's crazy!" The next thing I know, he's rushing through the bay doors over to his truck, and he climbs inside while it's still hanging diagonally from the lift. Then he crawls from the driver's seat to the passenger seat and opens the glove box. He pulls out a gun. "What are you doing, Charlie?" I ask him as my eyes widen in terror. He climbs back out of the truck and aims the gun right at the woman. I tell him, "Charlie, she didn't do anything wrong. She's just sitting here minding her own business, waiting for her car." Then he points the gun at me and says, "Don't try to stop me. I'm not going to end up like them. I'll go out my own way." The woman is still just sitting in the chair with her head tilted slightly down. I can't see anything except her wicked smile because her sun hat is blocking her face from view. Meanwhile, Charlie is screaming at the woman, telling her that he's going to end this right now. When I looked at Charlie, his arm started to slightly turn, and it continued to turn until the gun was aimed directly at him. I could tell he was trying to fight it. It was like something was forcing him to do it. He kept saying, "You can't make me. I won't do it. I'll kill." Then he shot himself in the head. Blood splatters all over my face. When Charlie's body collapses to the ground, I stared for a moment in shock, then picked up the gun and pointed it at her myself. But the little voice in my head told me that if I pulled that trigger, I would wind up just like Charlie. So I slowly lowered the gun and dropped it on the ground. The woman gets up and approaches me with that kind-hearted smile. Then she reaches for the same bloody hand that I used to point the gun at her. She grips it tightly and shakes it, telling me, "Thank you, that about does it. I got what I needed, so I think I'm good to go now." Then she heads to the door. "Why? Why leave me alive?" I call after her. She stopped and pointed at a sign that I had hanging in the front of my shop. It said, "I'm the mechanic, that's why." She replies, "You never harm the owner of the shop." Her car was parked right out front, untouched by the explosion, and it was in pristine condition. There was no longer a flat tire. She reached into her handbag and pulled out her sunglasses. It was dark now, so there was no need for them. Then she climbed into her car and drove off into the night. "Wait, so you and the woman are the only ones who survived that night? What about Cliff?" I curiously asked.
Yes, I survived, but I'd never been the same. Nothing like that ever happened before that night. And from that night forward, I never stayed at a shop past 6 p.m. Call me superstitious if you want, but I owned the shop for 30 years, and I never experienced anything like that until she showed up.
"And Cliff?" I asked again.
Oh yeah, and Cliff, that lucky bastard, he called off that day.
Jimmy approached us and asked for my keys. He told me that my car would be next up right after they finished Lester's. Lester told him as he looked at his watch again, tapping it.
I gotta get going.
Jimmy informed him that they were almost done. Then Lester laid his head back and closed his eyes. I pulled out my phone and began to scroll, thinking about the story that Lester had told me. I wondered if it had been true. Whatever the case, it was very interesting. I couldn't stop wondering about the mysterious woman. She'd never even mentioned her name, or at least Lester hadn't. An hour later, he woke up from his nap and Jimmy dangles his keys from behind the desk saying, "Oh, you've been done. I just didn't want to disturb you,"
About time.
he said as he got up and headed over to the counter to pay. I checked the time and it was 6:40. "Hey Lester, I guess you're not so superstitious after all." He looked at me confused. "It's past 6 o'clock, I told him. He glanced at his watch and said,
Very funny. I knew you were a funny one. It's only 5 something.
I told him, "Lester, I think you forgot to set your watch forward. Last night was daylight savings." He looked from me to Jimmy, and Jimmy agreed. "Yes, sir, it's 6:40. Lester turned around with a frightened face, looked out the window, and saw that it was already dark outside. Then another mechanic comes from the back room and asks Jimmy, "Have you seen Scott? He's been gone for an hour." Lester starts to panic, removes all of the money from his wallet and throws it at Jimmy. Jimmy says, "Whoa, this isn't enough. It's all ones." Lester tells him,
Here, just take my credit card. I don't have time for this. Just give me the keys. I'll come back for the card tomorrow.
Then the door chimes, and I turn around to see who it is. Lester freezes and a woman says, "I have a flat and don't have the tools to fix it. Could you help me?" She was quite good looking. Lester drops to his knees and then the power goes out. Now I'm starting to hear screaming coming from the back bay. Subscribe for a new story Mondays, Wednesdays, and don't forget Saturdays. See you next time on
Nina's Nightmares.
Really? You're supposed to click the like button, not me. Ugh.